certainly lots to talk about, as always. We just had Wisconsin Morning's News Standout of the Year. One of their Standout of the Year was Brenda Casilius, and so we just played that.
Great.
As far as the moves she has been making so far in her tenure. But one of the things we wanted to talk to you about today, which she has actually been on record considering talking about the opportunity of, is rightsizing.
Yes.
So what is rightsizing?
So, we have a smaller city now and fewer kids than we had a few years ago. It's about 15% since 2006 is when the numbers start from. And that means fewer kids.
Put that in context. What is fewer numbers?
Fewer numbers. So we were at peak probably about 120,000 students or so across the board. This year, it's about 108,000.
And is this just for MPS, or this is private schools, charter,
this
MPS?
This is everybody across the board. I would say those declines have been concentrated at MPS, but we are seeing, we're having fewer kids as a society. We're family sizes are getting smaller. Frankly, there are some challenges that we had here, specifically in Milwaukee. We had a teen pregnancy crisis for a number of years. We've done good work on resolving that. All this means, fewer kids that are entering school in any given year. And so the conversation that Dr. Casilius is having on the MPS side, and that we think, frankly, has to be a citywide conversation, is how do we have the right number of schools for the number of students that we have right now and that we're likely to have in the future? Because all the leading indicators, I think John Johnson at Marquette Law School did sort of the best piece on this a year and a half ago. That 15% decline that we've seen up till now, if anything, is going to get a little bit larger over the next few years. They are projecting 20% fewer kindergartners 5 years from now than we have in school today. So add it all up, and that's maybe 1,000 fewer kindergartners entering school 5 years from now than maybe we had 5 years ago. And it just means we need fewer seats, and that works its way through the system as kids get older.
So that, to me, on its face, without knowing, it feels a little counterintuitive, because I think so often when we think about problems with schools is overcrowded classrooms. So is that not an issue for MPS, or is that not an issue for Milwaukee schools, is overcrowded classrooms?
Both can happen at the same time.
Okay.
And so I would say, like here in Milwaukee, the story on the north side is very different than the story on the south side. And actually, I think MPS's own data pairs this out pretty well. They are going through their facilities planning process, and they laid this out. In one of the south side school districts, I think they're at 104% of capacity, meaning they've got more students being educated in that district than the seats they have available. And then in another district, they have, I think it's 65 or 70%. So there is a mismatch between where the seats are at and where the kids are at, and that's part of what's going on here. So you certainly do have individual schools that have more students in them than maybe they were built to serve. But that also is balanced by other school buildings elsewhere in the city where we've got high schools that were built for maybe 2,000, 3,000 students that might be serving 200 to 300 students.
Oh, wow.
So, right, take it all together.
Okay.
We got too many seats, even if that means at an individual campus, you might have too much. And some of that's got to do with school quality too, right? Families are still trying to find those highest performing schools, the ones that best fit their kids. Our Montessori schools here in Milwaukee are always in demand. Some of our private and charter schools are particularly high demand. They tend to fill up, even as other schools maybe are emptier before. So, right, like this is an optimization challenge. It's not just a simple everybody's, it's not uniform across every school in the city, which is what makes this a really complex conversation.
A couple of quick things. My former job in the legislature was down here at MPS with my former boss, Dale Schultz. Was super impressed with a lot of things, both public and private schools happening in Milwaukee. Our former show, we did it at Milwaukee South High School. Some great things happening there. I come from a more rural part of the state, and when you start talking about consolidation, it scares the bejeebers out of people because it's like, this is my identity. So help us understand fear versus facts.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Like, and this is a conversation that the state is having, right? In fact, I think this was a package of bills that were discussed in the legislature just a couple weeks ago. And I get it. It is scary. But the trend lines, I've given you the Milwaukee numbers. The state numbers are similar, maybe not quite as large scale. But if that school is the heart of your community, be that a neighborhood in Milwaukee or a rural town, these are real tricky conversations that require us wrestling with what is the value of a school? What does it mean to a community? We're having these same conversations in higher education too, where we've seen a lot of consolidation in the UW system. There's only so much that we can do to work ourselves away from the realities of we've got fewer people that are going to school, and so we got to reconcile ourselves to that, and that probably means fewer schools. But we got to do that in a way. I've said in other places before, we've got to all share in that pain. And we've also got to spend more time talking about the gain, right? Because part of the opportunity here is when we do that right sizing in smart ways, it allows for more resources to be unlocked for the kids in the schools that are in place, right? You've got schools in rural parts of the state that used to field football teams that aren't able to do that anymore, as a real concrete example, right? If you bring two high school communities together, here in Milwaukee, you've got a lot of co-op teams that play different sports. That's an opportunity, or maybe that preserves some sports opportunities or allows you to have more arts in that school building, or just frankly, the number of teachers that you need to serve. Like all of this matters, and it's not a simple, they're down by 30%, so cut 30, schools or whatever the case may be.
When you right size, have you found you can also maintain some of that identity for each community or each school?
Absolutely, right. It requires some thoughtful merging and bringing together of these communities, right? Like these are conversations that happen over periods of time, months and years, right? The conversation at the state level has been about how do we provide some, study support and understand what are the particulars that need to happen when you're merging two tax bases in a rural community. Here in Milwaukee, most of this is happening inside of one school district, so we don't have that conversation, but we still have real conversations about what does it mean, many of our most under-enrolled schools are on the north side of the city in historically Black neighborhoods that have struggled with disinvestment. How do we do this in a way that recognizes that reality, but also recognizes that there's a bit of a chicken and the egg issue here in terms of that disinvestment that's happened over generations? So it can't be the case that one part of the city or one set of schools or even one sector here in the city bears the full brunt of this. Everyone's got to play their part to get us to the number of students and the right levels of investment that we need to ensure that every kid's got a school that they can thrive at.
We are talking about right-sizing, which sounds logical on paper, but in practice, I would imagine is very messy, has a lot of stakeholders, and who do you actually bring in the room? Who's important to be in the room if this conversation moves forward?
I think who's in the room matters, but let me actually start with people who aren't in the room but are impacted by this, right? We've got to talk to parents and to families and to students and to communities. Oftentimes these decisions sort of happen in, someone in a central office or some people in a political space, sit in the room and put together a plan on paper, but they've never actually engaged with the communities that are being impacted by these decisions. I've said we're not the only city dealing with this. One of the better pictures I've seen all year was a picture of the mayor of Cleveland sitting in a chair at a barbershop, having a barbershop talk with a number of leaders in Cleveland, because they're going through this conversation as well. They're in the midst of considering, I think it's 37 school closures and consolidations there based on many of the same factors we're seeing here. That's what it takes, right? These conversations have to, yes, there's some data and information that can inform them, but ultimately you've got to go out and sell this. You got to go out and have the conversations in and with the community. We shared some polling, Kristin, maybe 2 or 3 times ago when I was here. Milwaukee's ready for this conversation as a city. We found 58-60% of people, in general supported the idea of consolidations. And when you gave them, even just a little bit of information in a poll, that number actually went up. But it requires those hard conversations, those difficult conversations to be had. And that's where I would say, it sounds like Dr. Castelos may have been in here earlier, having those conversations. Certainly as she's been out and about more generally, she's acknowledged this as a reality that we're facing here in the city. And I think that's a good and healthy dialogue for us to start.
I want to give you the opportunity to address people that might be out there listening, fans, say, well, why not just fix the public school? Why all this, downsizing, right-sizing, consolidation, whatever you want to call it? Is this a sign that we're ignoring the issues in the public schools? Or is this, as you alluded to earlier, people are not having as many kids anymore, and the facilities are too big? It's a necessity.
Look, let's speak to Milwaukee specifically and Milwaukee Public Schools specifically, right? We, as a community, have now passed 2 increases in funding, totaling about $350 million, right, just since 2020. Even with those additional resources, the district has still said they're looking at somewhere on the order of $100 million in terms of a structural gap to resolve.
And that's structural. So that means the buildings, right?
Right. That means the buildings, right?
And they're old buildings, a lot of them.
They were just talking, was it last week, about finishing the lead paint remediation work, right? And that's just that was sort of an emergency patch job that needed to happen. But when you look at sort of the full measure of what it would take to bring these buildings up to snuff like that, those dollar numbers get really big really quickly. Outside of the reach, I'm not certain that there is a tax increase or funding increase, state or local, in sight that could do that. There are legitimate conversations and disagreements to be had about how much of that should come from local property taxes. You would hear, people at the state tell you that, they've finally gotten back to the 2/3 state support that's existed for a long time. You'd hear others say, but, special education isn't funded where it needs to be. Frankly, there's a lot of truth on both sides of that conversation. And the reality is, even after we get through all of that, we're still going to confront the reality of 15% fewer students now than we had before, probably another 15 to 20% to come over the next 5 to 10 years if the projections and early demographic leading indicators hold. So the answer is some of both. Yes, I certainly believe we need to make sure that all of our kids have the resources that they need, but part of that is making sure that the resources that we have are actually making it to the classrooms where they're being served and not being diverted to keep up buildings that have 110, 120 kids in them in some cases.
And there's real trade-offs too, right? I mean, whether or not you're going to do, transportation issues. I don't want to say winners or losers. That sounds kind of bad.
No, but there's certainly pros and cons.
But I think that's a better way to put it. That's why you're the host of this show, Kristin.
Especially when I can get words out of my mouth.
But there are trade-offs.
There absolutely are trade-offs. There absolutely are pros and cons. It requires a conversation that gets out of, frankly, demagoguing it on either side, right? Like, this is not about, blaming one side, blaming the other. This is not about, political talking points. It's about just the hard number realities. What do we need to make sure that our kids are in schools that are safe, that are warm, that are effective in educating them, and that they're getting access to the resources and opportunities that they deserve? And, that's going to require all of us to have some, make some difficult choices, but we've got to be able to do that and have that dialogue with parents, with students, with the communities that are being impacted, not have it about them in other enclosed doors.
So just final, is this happening, or is this still the conversation about it potentially happening?
And, it's a good question, right? Like I said, you've heard Milwaukee Public Schools talk about this. You're seeing the legislature open this conversation. I worry that we're not moving quickly enough, right? We are now into our second or third decade of declines in terms of enrollment here in Milwaukee. I think we're into our second decade of it at the state level as well. None of these trends are changing anytime soon. There's no reason to believe that the cavalry is coming and somehow we're not going to have them. So my hope is that as we go forward, we can have them from a place of here are the facts and here are the data and here's how we make the best decisions we can, putting our students at first and at the center of these conversations. My fear is that we're going to get stuck in some of the political morass and impasse.
No, what? Of course not. All right, he is Colleston Morgan, President and Executive Director of City Forward Collective. We will see you in a couple weeks. Thanks as always for being here.
Of course, and happy holidays to you both.
As well as you.